The morning of October 15th, 1987, started like any other day in the remote hills of Montana. The Wilson family had lived in their small wooden cabin for almost 6 years now, far from the busy world and city noise. Robert Wilson worked odd jobs in the nearby town while his wife Janet took care of their 3 children at home. Their oldest boy, Danny, was 8 years old and loved exploring the woods behind their house. His little sister, Katie, just 6, followed him everywhere like a shadow. Baby Tommy, only 3 years old, spent most of his time playing with his toy trucks on the cabin's wooden floor. The family had moved here from back east when Danny was just 2. They wanted a simple life, away from Robert's troubled family who never seemed to understand their choices. Janet's relatives had cut ties with them years ago when they decided to live so far from civilization. But the Wilsons were happy in their little corner of the world. That October morning felt different, though. The air was dry, drier than Robert had ever felt it. The leaves on the trees were already brown and brittle, crunching underfoot even though fall had just begun. There hadn't been rain in over 2 months, and the local radio kept talking about fire warnings. Janet packed Danny and Katie their usual lunch of peanut butter sandwiches and sent them off to play by the creek. The little stream ran about 200 yards behind their cabin, winding through tall pine trees and rocky ground. It was their favorite spot, especially on warm days like this one. "Stay by the water," Janet called out as the children ran toward the trees. "And keep an eye on your sister, Danny." "I will, Mama," Danny shouted back, already disappearing into the tree line with Katie close behind. Robert had left early that morning to help a neighbor fix his truck. He promised to be back before dinner. Janet stayed home with little Tommy, doing laundry and preparing vegetables from their small garden. Around noon, she noticed something strange. The air smelled different, not like the usual pine and earth scents she was used to. It was sharper, more bitter. She looked out the window but didn't see anything unusual. The sky was still blue, though there seemed to be a thin haze in the distance. By 1 o'clock, that haze had grown thicker. Janet stepped outside and saw something that made her heart skip a beat. Far off to the west, beyond the ridgeline, dark smoke was rising into the sky. It looked like it was still miles away, but the wind was blowing in their direction. She called for Danny and Katie, but they were too far away to hear her. The creek was hidden behind thick trees, and her voice couldn't carry that distance. Janet wasn't worried yet. The fire looked far off, and surely Robert would be home soon. But as the minutes passed, the smoke grew darker and closer. What started as a thin line on the horizon became a thick, black cloud that began to block out the sun. The smell was getting stronger too, and Janet could hear something new. A low rumbling sound, like distant thunder that never stopped. 2:30, Janet made a decision that would haunt her forever. The smoke was clearly getting closer, and she needed to get Tommy and herself ready to leave quickly. She also needed to gather the children from the creek. But Tommy was napping, and she couldn't carry him all the way to the creek and back quickly. Enough. She decided to wake Tommy and put him in the truck, then drive down the old logging road that ran near the creek. She could pick up Danny and Katie, and they could all drive to safety together. It seemed like the smart thing to do. But Tommy was fussy when she woke him, crying and refusing to get dressed. Precious minutes ticked by as she tried to calm him down and get him ready. By the time she had him in the truck, the smoke was so thick she could barely see the mountains. Janet drove down the bumpy logging road, calling out the window for her children. The creek was loud from recent snowmelt upstream, and her voice seemed to disappear in the noise. She stopped the truck and got out, walking toward where she thought the children might be playing. That's when she heard it, a sound like a freight train getting closer and closer. The wind had picked up, and now she could see orange light dancing between the trees. The fire had jumped the ridge and was racing down toward their valley faster than anyone could have imagined. Janet ran back to the truck, her heart pounding. She had to get Tommy to safety first, then come back for the other children. But as she turned the key, the old engine sputtered and died. She tried again, pumping the gas pedal, but nothing happened. The orange light was getting brighter, and now she could hear trees cracking and falling in the distance. Thick smoke began to fill the air around her, making it hard to breathe. Janet grabbed Tommy and started running back toward the cabin, hoping Robert had returned and could help her find Danny and Katie. But Robert wasn't there. The cabin stood empty, and the fire was now visible through the trees behind it. Janet had maybe 10 minutes before the flames reached their home. She put Tommy in their old car parked by the cabin. It was newer and more reliable than the truck. She was about to go back for her other children when a wall of flame suddenly burst through the tree line. It moved faster than she ever thought possible, jumping from treetop to treetop like something alive and hungry. The heat hit her like opening an oven door, and the smoke became so thick she couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her. Janet made the hardest choice any parent could make. With tears streaming down her face and Tommy screaming in the back seat, she drove away from the cabin as fast as the old car would go. She had to get her youngest child to safety and trust that somehow Danny and Katie would find a way to survive by the water. The last thing she saw in her rearview mirror was their little cabin, the place where they had been so happy, disappearing in a wall of orange flame and black smoke. But Janet never made it to safety. 2 miles down the mountain road, a burning tree fell across the path, blocking her escape. The car caught fire, and by the time the firefighters reached that spot 3 days later, there was nothing left but twisted metal and heartbreak. Meanwhile, by the creek, Danny and Katie had heard the strange rumbling sound getting louder. When they climbed up on a big rock to look around, they saw something that made them both freeze with fear. Fire was everywhere, racing through the trees toward them like a wild animal. Danny grabbed his sister's hand and pulled her toward a small cave they had discovered while playing earlier that summer. It was just a shallow opening in the rock face beside the creek, barely big enough for both of them. But it was their only chance. They crawled inside, just as the fire reached the creek bank. For the next 6 hours they huddled together while the world outside turned into hell. Trees exploded from the heat and the air became so hot it hurt to breathe. The creek water boiled and steamed, but it never dried up completely. Katie cried for their mama, and Danny tried to be brave even though he was more scared than he had ever been in his life. He covered his sister with his jacket and used his shirt to filter the smoke-filled air. When she got thirsty, he crawled to the creek's edge and brought back water in his cupped hands. Night fell, but the fire continued to rage around them. Danny could see the orange glow through the cave opening, and the sound of burning trees never stopped. He held Katie tight and whispered stories to keep her calm, the same stories their mama used to tell them at bedtime. By morning, the fire had moved on, leaving behind a landscape that looked like another planet. Every tree was gone, reduced to black sticks pointing at the gray sky. The ground was covered in ash, and the air still smelled like smoke and burned wood. Danny knew they had to stay by the water. It was the only safe place left. He found berries growing along the creek bank that hadn't been touched by the fire, and he caught small fish with his bare hands to feed Katie. They drank creek water and slept in the cave, waiting for someone to find them. For 3 long days and nights, the 2 children survived alone in the burned wasteland. Danny never let Katie see how scared he was, and Katie trusted her big brother completely. They heard helicopters flying overhead sometimes, but the aircraft were too high up to see them in their hiding spot. On the 4th day, a search and rescue team finally found them. The men couldn't believe that 2 children had survived alone in such terrible conditions. Danny and Katie were thin, dirty, and scared, but they were alive. The rescue workers wrapped them in warm blankets and gave them food and clean water. But when Katie asked where Mama and Tommy and Daddy were, nobody knew what to say. The children didn't understand yet that they were the only ones left. As the helicopter carried them away from the burned valley, Danny looked down at what used to be their home. Nothing remained except black ground and the creek where they had hidden. Everything they had ever known was gone, turned to ash and memory. The fire had taken their family, their home, and their simple life in the mountains. But somehow it had also revealed something powerful, the strength of love between a brother and sister, and the will to survive even when everything else is lost. Danny held Katie's hand as they flew toward an uncertain future, not knowing that their real journey was just beginning. The hospital in Helena, Montana felt like a cold white maze to Danny and Katie. Everything smelled like cleaning supplies and medicine, nothing like their home in the mountains. Nurses came and went, speaking in soft voices and trying to smile, but their eyes looked sad when they looked at the children. Dr. Patricia Chen was different, though. She was a social worker who specialized in helping children who had lost their families. When she first met Danny and Katie, she sat down on the floor so she could look them in the eye, instead of talking down to them from above. "I know everything. Feels scary right now," she told them gently. "But I'm going to help you find people who will take care of you. There are family members out there who love you, even if you haven't seen them in a while." Danny didn't trust adults easily, but something about Dr. Chen seemed honest. Katie hadn't spoken to anyone since the rescue, only whispering to Danny, when she absolutely had to. She stayed close to her brother every second, holding onto his hand or his shirt like he might disappear. Dr. Chen started making phone calls, trying to piece together the Wilson family history. It wasn't easy. Robert and Janet had been very private people who kept to themselves. They had moved to Montana to get away from family drama back in Ohio, and they rarely talked about their relatives. The first person Dr. Chen called was Robert's brother William, who lived in Columbus, Ohio. He worked at a car factory and had 4 children of his own. When she explained what had happened to Robert and Janet, William went quiet for a long time. "That's terrible," he finally said. "Really terrible, but I can't take in 2 more kids. My wife would kill me, and we can barely afford the ones we've got. Times are tough right now, you understand?" Dr. Chen tried to explain that there would be financial help available, but William had already made up his mind. "Look, I feel bad about what happened," he said. "But Robert chose to live way out there in the middle of nowhere. He knew the risks. I got my own family to worry about." The phone call ended with William promising to think about it, but Dr. Chen could tell he had no intention of helping. Next, she tracked down Janet's sister, Linda, who lived in Cleveland. Linda worked as a secretary at a law firm and had been divorced for 2 years. She had no children of her own, which Dr. Chen hoped might make her more willing to help. But Linda's response was even colder than William's. "I told Janet not to marry that man," Linda said sharply. "I told her not to go live in the wilderness like some kind of pioneer family. She wouldn't listen to anybody. And now look what happened." Dr. Chen tried to keep her voice calm. "The children need family support. Right now. They've been through something terrible." "Well, that's not my problem," Linda replied. "I'm finally getting my life back together after my divorce. I can't take on 2 damaged kids right now. Maybe in a few years, when I'm more settled." In a few years meant never, and everyone knew it. Dr. Chen spent the next week calling every Wilson and Johnson relative she could find. Robert's elderly parents had died years ago, but she located some cousins and distant aunts and uncles. The conversations all went the same way. "Oh, how awful," they would say. "Those poor children." But then came the excuses. One cousin said his wife was expecting their first baby and they couldn't handle any more stress. An uncle claimed he was too old to raise children at 62. An aunt said she lived in a tiny apartment and there wasn't room for 2 kids. The hardest call was to Robert's oldest brother, David, who lived on a small farm in Iowa. David actually sounded interested at first, asking questions about Danny and Katie's health and what they had been through. "The boy sounds tough," David said. "And 6 years old isn't too bad. The girl could still learn to fit in. Let me talk to my wife and call you back." For 3 days, Dr. Chen hoped this might be the answer. David seemed like a decent man, and farm life might be good for children who were used to living in the country. But when David called back, his tone had completely changed. "My wife looked into it," he said, sounding uncomfortable. "She talked to some people who know about these things. They say kids who go through trauma like that, fires and losing parents, they never get over it. They have nightmares and behavior problems. Some of them even start fires themselves." Dr. Chen tried to explain that with proper counseling and support, traumatized children could heal and live normal lives. But David had already decided. "I'm sorry," he said, "but we can't risk it. We've got our own kids to think about. What if something happens to them because we brought troubled children into our home?" Meanwhile, Danny and Katie were moved from the hospital to a temporary foster home with the Rodriguez family. Rita and Carlos Rodriguez had been taking in emergency foster children for 10 years. They were kind people who genuinely wanted to help, but their house was already full with 3 foster children and 2 of their own. Danny and Katie slept on air mattresses in the living room, and there was barely enough space for everyone at dinner time. The other foster children had their own problems and pain, and adding 2 more traumatized kids to the mix created tension throughout the house. Danny tried to protect Katie from the chaos, but he was just 8 years old and overwhelmed by everything that had happened. He started having nightmares about the fire, waking up screaming and covered in sweat. Katie wouldn't sleep unless Danny was right beside her, and she refused to eat unless he fed her first. Dr. Chen visited them every few days, and she could see that both children were getting worse instead of better. Danny had started hoarding food, hiding crackers and fruit under his pillow because he was afraid there wouldn't be enough to eat. Katie had stopped making any sounds at all, not even whispering to her brother. "We need to find them a permanent home," Dr. Chen told her supervisor. "They need stability and one-on-one attention. This temporary situation isn't working." But the family search was going nowhere. Dr. Chen had contacted 37 relatives on both sides of the Wilson family, and not one of them was willing to take in Danny and Katie. After 3 weeks with the Rodriguez family, the children were moved to another temporary placement with the Hendersons, an older couple who specialized in short-term care for traumatized children. But their house felt like a hospital, with strict rules and scheduled activities. Danny and Katie weren't allowed to sleep in the same room, which caused Katie to have panic attacks every night. Danny became aggressive for the first time in his life, pushing and hitting when adults tried to separate him from his sister. He didn't understand why grown-ups kept breaking up the only family he had left. They belonged together, Dr. Chen argued with the Hendersons. Separating them is making everything worse. "The boy is too protective," Mrs. Henderson replied. "The girl will never learn to be independent if her brother does everything for her. They both need to heal as individuals." But Danny and Katie weren't individuals. They were a team that had survived hell together. Trying to split them up was like trying to cut a person in half. After 2 weeks with the Hendersons, the children were moved again, this time to a group home for kids with special needs. The Davidson Home for Children housed 12 kids between the ages of 5 and 16, all of them dealing with serious emotional or behavioral problems. It was here that Dr. Chen realized how desperate the situation had become. Danny and Katie sat together in a corner of the common room, not playing with the other children or participating in activities. Katie hadn't spoken a word in over a month, and Danny only talked to ask when they could go home. "Where is home?" Dr. Chen asked him gently. "With Katie," Danny answered immediately. "Home is wherever Katie is safe." That night, Dr. Chen went back to her office and stared at the Wilson family file. 37 phone calls, 37 rejections. 2 children who had already lost everything now being shuffled from place to place like unwanted packages. She thought about her own daughter, safe at home with her husband. What would she do if something happened to her and her husband? Would their relatives fight to take care of their little girl? Or would she end up lost in the system like Danny and Katie? The truth was painful but clear. Some children were just unlucky. They were born into families with no safety net, no relatives who cared enough to sacrifice for them. When tragedy struck, these children fell through the cracks, becoming nobody's responsibility. But Dr. Chen wasn't ready to give up yet. There had to be someone, somewhere, who would see what she saw when she looked at Danny and Katie, 2 brave, loving children who deserved a chance at happiness. She opened her phone book and started looking for a different approach. Maybe the answer wasn't in the Wilson family tree. Maybe it was somewhere else entirely, with someone who chose to love children not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The next morning, Dr. Chen placed an ad in the local newspaper. 2 young siblings, survivors of family tragedy seeking permanent adoptive family. Children are healthy, intelligent, and devoted to each other. Looking for patient, loving parents who understand that healing takes time. She didn't mention the fire, the trauma, or the nightmares. She focused on what mattered most, that Danny and Katie were children who needed love just like any other children. The phone started ringing that afternoon. Jack Miller had been reading the same newspaper story for the third time that morning, his coffee growing cold in the mug beside him. The article was buried on page 7, just a small piece about the children who had survived the big fire 2 months ago. Most people had probably skipped right past it, but something about those few sentences had hit Jack like a punch to the chest. 2 young siblings, survivors of family tragedy, seeking permanent adoptive family. Jack set the paper down and looked around his empty kitchen. The silence in the house was so complete he could hear the old refrigerator humming in the corner. This was his morning routine: coffee, newspaper, and the kind of quiet that most people would find peaceful. But to Jack, it had started to feel like a prison. He was 43 years old and had been living alone on his cattle ranch for 8 years now. His marriage to Beth had ended when they finally accepted what the doctors had been telling them for years. They would never have children of their own. The treatments, the hope, the disappointment, the blame, it had worn them both down until there was nothing left between them but sadness. After the divorce, Jack had thrown himself into ranch work. He expanded his herd, improved his pastures, and built a business that other ranchers respected. He was successful by any measure, with money in the bank and 500 acres of prime Montana grazing land. But success felt hollow when there was nobody to share it with or pass it on to. Jack had dated a few women over the years, but those relationships always ended the same way. The women were nice enough, but they wanted families of their own someday. When they learned about Jack's situation, they would try to be understanding for a while. Then one by one they would drift away to find men who could give them what they really wanted. So Jack had gotten used to being alone. He told himself he was fine with it. He had his cattle, his horses, and his work. He had friends in town who invited him to barbecues and poker games. It was a good life, even if it sometimes felt empty. But reading about Danny and Katie Wilson changed something inside Jack. He couldn't stop thinking about 2 children with no family, being shuffled around from place to place. He knew what it felt like to want something so badly and not be able to have it. The difference was, his wanting had been for children who didn't exist yet. These children already existed, and they needed someone to want them. That evening, Jack drove to Murphy's General Store in town, where the local ranchers often gathered to drink coffee and complain about cattle prices. The conversation, as it often did these days, turned to the Wilson children. "Shame what happened to those kids," said Bill Patterson, stirring sugar into his coffee. "But I heard from my wife who works at the courthouse that nobody in their family wants them." "Can't say I blame them," replied Pete Stevens, an older rancher, with grown children of his own. Taking on 2 kids that age is hard enough when they're your own, but kids who've been through something like that, they're damaged goods. Probably never get over it. "I heard the boy's been acting up," added Bill, "fighting with other kids, not sleeping right, and the little girl won't even talk. What kind of family life would that be?" Jack listened to the conversation and felt his jaw tighten. These were decent men, good neighbors who would help anyone with a sick cow or a broken fence. But they were talking about Danny and Katie like they were broken machinery instead of children who had lost everything. "Maybe they just need time," Jack said quietly. Pete looked at him with surprise. Jack rarely joined in these discussions, preferring to listen rather than talk. "Time for what?" Pete asked. "Some things can't be fixed, Jack. These kids saw their parents die in a fire. That changes a person forever." "So does losing a ranch to drought or a spouse to cancer," Jack replied, thinking of his own losses. "But people find ways to keep going." "That's different," Bill said. "We're adults. We understand that bad things happen. But kids? They need stability, normal families, mothers who know how to handle their problems. What could a bachelor rancher do with 2 traumatized children?" The question hung in the air, and Jack didn't have an answer. What could he do? He knew nothing about raising children. He'd never changed a diaper, helped with homework, or dealt with nightmares. His house had sharp corners, dangerous tools, and no toys or safety equipment. But as he drove home that night, Jack couldn't shake the image of two children sleeping in a group home, holding on to each other because they had no one else. He thought about his own childhood, when his father had worked long hours and his mother had been too busy with his younger siblings to pay much attention to him. The ranch had been his escape then, the animals, the open space, the sense of purpose that came from caring for living things. Maybe that could work for Danny and Katie too. Maybe what they needed wasn't a perfect family with all the right experience. Maybe they just needed someone who wouldn't give up on them. The next morning, Jack found himself driving to the county social services office before he could change his mind. Dr. Chen was surprised to see him. Most people called first to ask questions, but Jack had never been much for phone conversations. "I want to know about those children," he said simply. "The ones in the newspaper." Dr. Chen studied him carefully. She had gotten several calls about her newspaper ad, but most of them had been from people who wanted babies, not school-age children with trauma histories. A few others had hung up when she explained the situation honestly. "Can you tell me about your experience with children?" she asked. "None," Jack admitted. "Never had any of my own." "Are you married?" "Divorced. 8 years now." Dr. Chen made notes on a pad of paper, and Jack could see the skepticism in her eyes. He was exactly the kind of applicant that social services usually discouraged. Single, no parenting experience, and probably no understanding of what he was getting into. "Mr. Miller," she said gently, "Danny and Katie have very special needs. They've been through severe trauma, and they're going to need years of therapy and support. The boy has been having behavioral problems, and the girl hasn't spoken in months. It's not like adopting healthy infants." "I figured that," Jack said. "I also figured that's probably why nobody wants them." Dr. Chen was taken aback by his directness. Most potential parents tried to convince her they could handle anything. Jack seemed to understand exactly how difficult the situation was. "Why do you want to do this?" she asked. Jack was quiet for a long moment, trying to find the right words. How could he explain that he'd been feeling like half a person for years? That his house felt more like a museum than a home? That he lay awake at night sometimes wondering what the point of all his success was if there was nobody to care about? "I've got a big ranch," he said finally. "Plenty of room, good schools nearby, and I can provide for them financially. I know, I don't have experience with kids, but I learn fast. And I figure maybe they need someone who won't quit on them, even when things get hard." Raising traumatized children is incredibly challenging, Dr. Chen warned. There will be setbacks, difficult behaviors, and times when you question whether you're helping or making things worse. Are you prepared for that? Jack thought about the hardest times in his own life. The years of trying to have children, the slow death of his marriage, the loneliness that followed. He had survived all of that. Maybe his own struggles had prepared him for this. "I've been through hard times before," he said. "I'm still here." Dr. Chen made more notes, then looked up at him again. There was something about this quiet rancher that intrigued her. He wasn't making grand promises or painting unrealistic pictures of happy families. He seemed to understand that love wasn't always enough. Sometimes you needed stubbornness and patience and the willingness to keep showing up even when everything went wrong. "I'll need to do a background check, visit your home, and have you meet with our child psychologist," she said. "The process usually takes several months." "These kids have been waiting long enough," Jack replied. "What can I do to speed things up?" That afternoon, Jack called his lawyer, his doctor, and his bank. He requested background checks, financial statements, and character references. He drove to the library and checked out every book they had about child psychology and trauma recovery. He went to the hardware store and bought cabinet locks, outlet covers, and everything else the safety checklist required. For the first time in years, Jack Miller had a purpose beyond just getting through each day. He was going to become a father, even if he had no idea how to do it. And somewhere across town in a crowded group home, Danny and Katie Wilson were about to meet the person who would change their lives forever, if he could convince them to trust one more adult who promised not to leave them. The first time Jack Miller met Danny and Katie Wilson, They were sitting in the corner of the group home's visiting room like two small animals backed against a wall. Danny, now 9 years old after months in the system, kept his arm protectively around his sister's shoulders. Katie, 7, hadn't looked up from the floor since Jack walked in. Dr. Chen had prepared Jack for this moment, explaining that the children had been disappointed by adults too many times to trust easily. But seeing their frightened faces made Jack's chest tighten with an emotion he hadn't expected, a fierce protective anger at everyone who had failed these kids. "Danny, Katie, this is Mr. Miller," Dr. Chen said softly. "He'd like to talk with you about maybe living on his ranch." Danny's eyes flickered up briefly, taking in Jack's worn boots, faded jeans, and weathered hands. The boy had learned to read adults quickly. The ones who talked too much usually disappeared fast. The ones who made big promises never kept them. This man didn't say anything at all, just sat down on the floor so he wasn't towering over them. "I've got horses," Jack said simply. "And cattle. Creek runs right through my property. Good for fishing if you're interested." Katie peered up through her hair for just a second before looking down again. Danny remained suspicious. "How many other kids live there?" Danny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "None," Jack replied. "Just me. It's pretty quiet." This seemed to surprise Danny. Every adult who had talked to them before had other children, other priorities, other reasons why Danny and Katie would have to fit into an already crowded life. "Why do you want us?" Danny asked, the question that had been burning inside him for months. Jack considered lying, giving some easy answer about always wanting children or loving kids. But something about Danny's direct stare demanded honesty. "My house is too quiet," Jack said. "Has been for a long time. And I figure maybe you two are tired of being around too many people all the time." It wasn't much of a conversation, but it was a start. Danny didn't smile, but he didn't turn away either. Katie stayed silent, but she stopped hiding behind her hair. The social services process moved slowly, with background checks, home visits, and psychological evaluations. Jack passed every requirement, though Dr. Chen worried about his lack of experience with children. The ranch house was deemed suitable after Jack installed safety equipment and child-proofed the kitchen. The first transition visit was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon. Jack picked up Danny and Katie from the group home and drove them out to see the ranch. They sat silently in his pickup truck, staring out at the wide Montana landscape rolling past the windows. When they reached the ranch, Jack didn't try to give them a grand tour or overwhelm them with activities. He simply showed them the house, their rooms, the kitchen, the living room with its stone fireplace. Then he took them outside to see the animals. Something shifted when they reached the barn. Danny straightened up when he saw the horses, and for the first time he looked genuinely interested instead of just wary. Katie moved closer to the fence where a gentle mare named Honey was grazing. "Can we touch her?" Danny asked. "Sure," Jack said, opening the gate. "Honey's real gentle. She likes kids." Danny approached the horse slowly, his hand extended. When Honey nuzzled his palm, looking for treats, Danny almost smiled. Katie hung back until the mare turned those soft brown eyes on her. Then she, too, stepped forward. For 20 minutes, the children stood with the horse, running their hands over her neck and mane. They didn't talk, but they didn't look scared either. Jack watched from a distance, sensing that this was important somehow. When it was time to return to the group home, Danny surprised Jack with a question. "Do you know how to take care of sick animals?" "Been doing it for 20 years, Jack replied. "Why?" "Just wondering," Danny said, but something in his eyes suggested it mattered more than he was letting on. The second visit went better. This time, Katie spoke her first words in months, asking if she could give Honey some carrots. Her voice was rusty from disuse, but hearing it made Jack's throat tight with emotion. Danny asked more questions about the ranch. How many cattle Jack owned, what kind of work needed to be done, whether there were any dangerous animals around. Jack answered honestly, explaining about rattlesnakes and mountain lions, but also about how to stay safe and what precautions to take. "I'm not going to lie to you about anything," Jack told them. "Ranch life has risks, just like any other kind of life, but I'll teach you how to handle whatever comes up." The third visit was overnight, their first time sleeping at the ranch. Jack had prepared their rooms carefully with new beds and basic furniture, but he hadn't gone overboard with decorations or toys. He sensed that Danny and Katie weren't ready for anyone to assume what they might like. That night, Jack learned just how damaged these children really were. Danny woke up screaming from a nightmare about fire, and when Jack went to comfort him, the boy fought him off with surprising strength. It took 20 minutes to calm him down, and even then, Danny remained rigid and watchful. Katie had her own problems. She refused to sleep in her own room, insisting on dragging her mattress into Danny's room so they could be together. When Jack suggested she might be more comfortable in her own space, she had her first panic attack, gasping for breath and shaking until Danny held her and whispered that everything was okay. Jack realized that night how much he didn't know about helping traumatized children. Dr. Chen had given him books to read, but reading about nightmares and panic attacks was different from watching two kids relive their worst fears. The next morning, Jack found both children in the kitchen before dawn, sitting at the table with their few possessions packed in garbage bags beside their chairs. "You taking us back now?" Danny asked, his voice flat with resignation. Jack looked at these two children who expected to be returned like defective merchandise, and something broke open inside his chest. "Only if you want to go back," he said. "But I was hoping you might. Want to stay and help me with the morning chores?" Danny's eyes widened with surprise. Katie looked up from staring at her hands. "Even after last night?" Danny asked. "Especially after last night," Jack replied. "Figured you both could use some fresh air and hard work. Always helps me when I'm feeling rough." That morning, Jack taught Danny how to feed the horses and cattle. The boy was eager to learn and had good instincts around the animals. Katie was more hesitant, but she helped gather eggs from the chicken coop and seemed proud when Jack praised her gentle touch with the hens. After breakfast, Dr. Chen called to check on how the overnight visit had gone. There were some challenges, Jack admitted, not wanting to lie about the difficulties. But we worked through them. "Are you sure you're prepared for this?" Dr. Chen asked. "The nightmares and anxiety might continue for months or even years." Jack looked out the kitchen window where Danny was showing Katie how to brush one of the horses. The little girl was actually smiling as she copied her brother's careful movements. "Dr. Chen," Jack said, "I spent 8 years of my marriage hoping and praying for children. The good Lord didn't see fit to give me any the usual way. But he put these two kids in my path for a reason, and I'm not about to question his timing." The transition period stretched over 2 months, with longer and longer visits until Danny and Katie were essentially living at the ranch full-time. There were setbacks, nights when Danny woke up screaming, days when Katie refused to speak to anyone, moments when both children seemed to retreat back into the protective shell they had built around themselves. But there were breakthroughs too. Danny discovered he had a natural gift for working with animals, and the horses seemed to calm down around him in a way that impressed even Jack. Katie began talking more, first to the animals, then to Jack, and finally to Dr. Chen during their therapy sessions. The turning point came on a cold December morning when Jack's best breeding mare, Luna, went into difficult labor. Jack had been up all night trying to help her, but the foal was positioned wrong and wouldn't come. By dawn, it was clear that both mother and baby might die without immediate intervention. Danny had been watching from the barn doorway, his face tight with worry. He had grown attached to Luna over the months, feeding her treats and brushing her coat every day. "Is she going to die?" he asked quietly. "Not if I can help it," Jack replied, rolling up his sleeves. "But I could use an assistant if you're up for it." For the next 3 hours, Danny helped Jack work to save Luna and her foal. The boy followed instructions perfectly, handed over tools, held flashlights steady, and never once complained about the blood or mess. When the foal finally slipped free and took its first shaky breath, Danny let out a cheer that brought Katie running from the house. That night at dinner, something had changed. Danny looked at Jack differently, not with wariness or fear, but with respect and something that might have been the beginning of trust. "You saved her," Danny said simply. "We saved her," Jack corrected. "Couldn't have done it without you." It was Katie who spoke the words that officially made them a family, though nobody realized it at the time. "Can we name the baby horse Hope?" she asked, her voice clear and strong. Jack smiled. "I think Hope is a perfect name." And for the first time since the fire, both children smiled back.